The morning of September 17th, 1861, broke cold and gray over the Shenandoah Valley. The kind of morning where your breath hangs in the air like gun smoke and every sound carries twice as far as it should. In a clearing 3 miles west of Winchester, Virginia, surrounded by oak trees that had stood for 200 years, a shirtless black man named Ezra Williams stood facing 3 armed men with nothing but a hickory branch raised above his head. The scars on his back caught the pale morning light, raised welts that told a story of 23 years in bondage. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed approximately 180 pounds, and in exactly 47 seconds, he would do something that local newspapers would refuse to print for fear of inspiring similar acts of resistance. Behind him, 30 yards through the undergrowth, his 12-year-old daughter Sarah pressed herself against a limestone outcropping, her hand clamped over her mouth to keep from crying out. She'd been running with her father for 4 days since they'd escaped the Hargrove plantation during a thunderstorm that covered their tracks. 4 days of sleeping in ditches, eating raw turnips stolen from fields, walking through streams to confuse the dogs. Now the dogs had found them anyway. She could hear them baying somewhere in the distance, getting closer. The 3 men facing her father were professional slave catchers, hired by Colonel Marcus Hargrove at $10 per head, plus expenses. The one in the center was William Trask, 42 years old, a former overseer from South Carolina who turned to bounty hunting after being fired for excessive brutality. Even by the standards of 1861 Virginia, standards that permitted the buying and selling of human beings and the whipping of children, William Trask had acquired a reputation that made other white men uncomfortable. He'd brought back 37 runaways over the past 6 years, 12 of them dead. The 2 men flanking him were brothers, James and Robert McCready, both carrying Springfield rifle muskets with fixed bayonets. The McCreadys came from good Presbyterian stock, attended church every Sunday, and saw no contradiction between their faith and their profession. They'd tracked Ezra and Sarah for 72 hours through terrain that would have broken lesser men, following a trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves that only experienced hunters could read. William Trask held a Colt Navy revolver pointed directly at Ezra's chest, his thumb on the hammer, his finger resting lightly against the trigger. The distance between them was maybe 15 feet. Close enough that Trask couldn't possibly miss, but far enough that Ezra might have half a second to react. The hickory branch in Ezra's hands was approximately 4 feet long, thick as a man's wrist at one end, tapering to the thickness of 2 fingers at the other. He'd picked it up 20 minutes ago when he heard the dogs getting closer, not because he thought he could win a fight against 3 armed men, but because he decided 4 days ago that he would never again allow white men to put their hands on him without a fight. That decision, made in a moment of clarity during a thunderstorm while watching his daughter sleep under a dripping pine bough, had transformed him from property into something else entirely. "Put it down, boy," Trask said, his voice carrying that particular mixture of amusement and contempt that white men reserved for black people who'd forgotten their place. His accent was thick Virginia Piedmont, vowels stretched long and lazy. "You think you're going to fight 3 guns with a stick? That's the kind of thinking that got you whipped in the first place." The morning air hung still between them, heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke from a distant farmhouse. Somewhere a crow called out 3 times and went silent. The temperature was maybe 52 degrees, cold enough that Ezra's bare chest showed goosebumps, warm enough that Trask had unbuttoned his coat. 23 years. That's how long Ezra had been alive. Born in 1838 on the Hargrove plantation, property of Colonel Marcus Hargrove, valued in the estate ledgers at $850 as of his last appraisal in 1860. He'd picked cotton from age 5 until his hands bled. survived 2 whippings that should have killed him, watched his mother sold south when he was 7, and learned to read in secret by studying discarded newspapers that the Hargrove children left scattered around the plantation grounds. The hickory branch in his hands weighed maybe 3 pounds. Seasoned wood that had fallen during last winter's ice storm and spent 6 months curing on the forest floor. The physics of what he was about to attempt were simple but brutal. A human skull can withstand approximately 520 pounds of compressive force before fracturing. A hickory branch swung with sufficient velocity by a man of Ezra's size and strength could deliver approximately 800 to 1,000 pounds of impact force. The McCready brothers shifted their weight, their boots crunching in the dry leaves. Robert, the younger of the two at 26, raised his rifle slightly, the bayonet catching the morning light. James, 31 and the more experienced tracker, took a step to the left, trying to get a better angle. They were good at what they did. They'd cornered runaways in caves, swamps, abandoned barns, and mountain passes. They knew how to read the landscape, how to anticipate where desperate people would run. But they'd never faced someone like Ezra Williams, because most of the people they hunted were running toward something, hope or freedom or the imagined safety of the North. Ezra wasn't running toward anything anymore. He was running away from everything, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. "Last chance," Trask said, cocking the hammer on his revolver with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet clearing. "Drop the stick and come peaceful. We'll take you back. You'll get your whipping, and that'll be the end of it. Keep this up, and I'll put a bullet in your knee, and you'll spend the rest of your life crippled." It was a reasonable offer by the standards of the time. Damaged property was still property, still had value, even if that value was diminished. A slave with a shattered kneecap could still work in some capacity, picking cotton while sitting, shelling peas, mending clothes. The Hargrove plantation had 3 such crippled slaves, men who tried to run and paid the price. They sat in the sun all day, their ruined legs stretched out before them, performing tasks that required hands but not mobility, living examples of what happened to those who forgot their place. But Ezra had spent 4 days tasting something he'd never experienced in his 23 years. And the taste of it had changed him at a fundamental level. Freedom wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't a feeling of lightness or joy or relief. It was cold and hungry and terrifying, full of sounds that might be dogs or danger, full of horizons that promised nothing but more walking. But it was his. Every step he took was a step he'd chosen. Every moment of fear belonged to him, and not to Colonel Hargrove or William Trask or the system that had ground up generations of black bodies and called it agriculture. He'd explained this to Sarah 2 nights ago while they huddled in a tobacco barn, waiting for the moon to set. "They can kill me," he'd told her, his voice barely a whisper. "But they can't make me property again. You understand? I'm done being property." Sarah had nodded, her eyes huge in the darkness, not fully understanding but recognizing the change in her father. The way his voice had taken on a quality she'd never heard before. She was 12 years old, born in 1849, also listed in the Hargrove estate ledgers, with a value that increased each year as she grew. By age 15, her value would peak, and she would face the particular horrors that the system reserved for young black women. Ezra knew this. Every enslaved father knew this. It was the knowledge that made some men compliant and others desperate. Ezra had chosen desperation. Now, in this clearing, with 3 armed men facing him and his daughter hiding 30 yards behind him, Ezra Williams made a calculation. The revolver in Trask's hand had an effective range of about 50 yards, but accuracy dropped dramatically beyond 15 feet. The rifle muskets the McCready brothers carried were more accurate at distance, but took between 20 and 30 seconds to reload after firing. A hickory branch traveled approximately 40 feet per second when swung by a strong man using proper technique. He shifted his weight, planting his left foot slightly behind his right, rotating his hips to generate torque. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Trask saw it and his finger tightened on the trigger. "Don't," Trask said, the amusement gone from his voice now, replaced by something colder. "Don't make me shoot you." The morning light was getting stronger, filtering through the oak canopy in dusty beams that picked out individual leaves and made the spider webs strung between branches look like threads of gold. The dogs were closer now, their baying taking on that higher pitch that meant they'd caught fresh scent. Behind the three men, Ezra could see the handlers struggling to hold the leads. Two men with 4 dogs straining forward, their muscles bunched under brown and white coats. Everything that happened next took approximately 14 seconds. Ezra Williams raised the hickory branch higher, his arms forming a perfect arc above his head. And something in his face changed. The fear that had been there a moment before drained away, replaced by an expression that Trask would later struggle to describe in his report. Not rage, exactly. Not even hatred. Something more final than that. Acceptance, maybe. Or recognition. The understanding that this moment had been inevitable from the day he was born into a system that treated human beings as agricultural equipment. That this confrontation had been building for 23 years through every indignity and every casual cruelty, and that it was going to end here, one way or another. Trask fired. The Colt Navy revolver made a sound like a small cannon, a flat crack that echoed off the surrounding hills and sent birds erupting from nearby trees. The .36 caliber ball traveled at approximately 750 feet per second, covering the 15 feet between muzzle and target in roughly 1/50th of a second. In that same fraction of time, Ezra Williams twisted his torso, rotating his right shoulder back while his left shoulder came forward, a movement he'd learned not from any teacher, but from 3 weeks spent watching the Hargroves' eldest son practice swordsmanship with a fencing master hired from Richmond. The ball passed within 4 inches of Ezra's left ear, close enough that he felt the air displacement, close enough that the sound was like being inside a bell when it rings. Then he was moving forward, closing the distance, his bare feet finding purchase on the leaf-covered ground, his arms bringing the hickory branch down in an arc that started above his head and terminated at William Trask's left temple. The impact produced a sound like a watermelon splitting, a wet crack that was somehow both dull and sharp at the same time. Trask's head snapped to the right with sufficient force that Sarah, watching from 30 yards away, could hear his neck vertebrae grinding together. He was unconscious before he hit the ground, his body making a heavy thud in the leaves, the revolver tumbling from suddenly slack fingers. The entire movement, from the moment Trask fired to the moment his body hit the ground, took less than 2 seconds. Robert McCready, the younger brother, tried to bring his rifle musket to bear, but he was standing too close, and the long barrel with its fixed bayonet was unwieldy at intimate distance. Ezra reversed his grip on the hickory branch, holding it now like a club rather than a staff, and drove the thick end into Robert's solar plexus with sufficient force to crack 3 ribs. The young man doubled over, his breath coming out in a sound like a steam whistle, and Ezra followed through with a rising strike that caught him under the chin. Teeth shattered, blood sprayed. Robert McCready went down on top of William Trask, their bodies tangling together in an undignified heap. James McCready, the older brother, was the dangerous one. He was standing far enough back that he had time to raise his rifle musket properly, time to sight along the barrel, time to steady his breath the way his father had taught him when he was 10 years old and learning to shoot turkey. He had Ezra dead center in his sights, had the pressure on the trigger just short of the break point, had every advantage a trained marksman could want. And then Sarah Williams, 12 years old, weighing maybe 75 pounds, emerged from behind the limestone outcropping with a rock the size of a grapefruit in both hands and brought it down on the back of James McCready's skull with every ounce of strength her small body could generate. The sound was different from the sound Ezra's hickory branch had made, more hollow, more final. James McCready's finger convulsed on the trigger, and the rifle musket discharged, the ball going wide, burying itself in an oak trunk 20 feet to Ezra's left. Then James was falling, his body going slack, his legs folding under him with a peculiar, boneless quality that only unconsciousness or death produces. The entire confrontation, from the moment Trask fired his revolver to the moment James McCready hit the ground, had lasted approximately 14 seconds. 3 armed professional slave catchers, men who'd made their living hunting human beings through wilderness terrain, had been incapacitated by an unarmed man with a tree branch and a 12-year-old girl with a rock. The dogs were still baying, but their handlers had stopped moving forward, had seen what happened in the clearing, and were now backing slowly away, pulling the protesting dogs with them. Ezra Williams stood in the center of the clearing, the hickory branch still gripped in both hands, his chest heaving, sweat running down his torso despite the morning chill. William Trask was breathing but unconscious, blood leaking from his left ear. Robert McCready was curled in a ball, making small whimpering sounds, his hands pressed to his face. James McCready wasn't moving at all. Sarah dropped the rock and ran to her father, and Ezra caught her with one arm, pulling her against his side while keeping the hickory branch raised with his other hand, his eyes scanning the trees for more threats. "We have to run," Sarah said, her voice high and tight with fear and adrenaline. "Papa, we have to run now." But Ezra didn't move. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the 3 men on the ground, men who'd hunted him like an animal, who'd intended to drag him back to the Hargrove plantation in chains, men who represented a system that had owned him body and soul since the moment of his birth, men who were no longer capable of owning anything. "No," Ezra said quietly. He lowered the hickory branch and looked at his daughter. "No more running, not like this, not anymore." And that's when the real story began. Because what Ezra Williams did next would change not just his own life and his daughter's life, but would alter the course of events in a way that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. He picked up William Trask's revolver from where it had fallen in the leaves, checked that it still had 5 live rounds in the cylinder, and turned to face the dog handlers who were still backing away, their faces pale with shock. "You tell Colonel Hargrove," Ezra called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising authority, "that his property has decided to renegotiate the terms of his employment." The dog handlers ran. The dogs, confused by their handler's sudden retreat, stopped baying and looked back and forth between the men they were supposed to be tracking and the men who were supposed to be in control. One of them, a blue tick hound named Memphis, whined and lay down, his head on his paws. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that had been gathering in the low places. In the clearing, 3 professional slave catchers lay on the ground, incapacitated by a man they'd underestimated and a system they'd taken for granted. And Ezra Williams, 23 years old, formerly property valued at $850, stood with his daughter pressed against his side and a revolver in his hand, trying to figure out what came next when you'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Chapter 2. News traveled slowly in the Shenandoah Valley in September 1861, but some news traveled faster than others, and the story of what happened in that clearing 3 miles west of Winchester spread through both black and white communities with remarkable speed. The dog handlers who'd run from the scene reached Winchester by noon, their story getting more elaborate with each telling. By evening, Colonel Marcus Hargrove had assembled 23 men, armed them with whatever weapons they could muster, and set out to recapture his property and restore order. But Ezra Williams and his daughter were already gone, vanished into the countryside like smoke in wind. What followed over the next 6 weeks was a campaign of resistance that local authorities tried desperately to keep quiet, fearing it would inspire similar acts. Ezra didn't head north toward the promised safety of Union lines. Instead, he moved south and west, deeper into Confederate territory, using his knowledge of the plantation system to visit enslaved communities at night, spreading a simple message. They could fight. The hickory branch he'd used to incapacitate William Trask became something of a legend among enslaved people in 3 counties. Some said he'd carved notches in it to mark his victories. Others claimed he'd painted it with the blood of slave catchers. The truth was simpler and more powerful. It was just a tree branch. But in Ezra's hands, it had become a tool of liberation. Proof that the system which claimed absolute power over black bodies was vulnerable in ways no one had fully understood. The second confrontation came 18 days after the first, on October 5, 1861, at a plantation 14 miles south of Winchester. Ezra had been hiding in the woods nearby, watching the routine, learning the patterns. The overseer, a man named Calvin Brewster, had a habit of walking alone through the slave quarters every evening around dusk, making his presence known, asserting authority. On October 5th, Ezra waited for him behind the smokehouse, armed now with both the hickory branch and the revolver taken from William Trask. When Brewster came around the corner, Ezra stepped out of the shadows. "Evening," Ezra said pleasantly. Brewster reached for his pistol, but he was too slow, too accustomed to compliance, too certain of his authority. The hickory branch caught him across the forearm with enough force to break both bones. The pistol fell. Brewster screamed, and before any of the other white men on the plantation could respond, Ezra was gone again, vanished into the darkness, leaving behind an overseer who would never use a whip again, and 7 enslaved workers who'd seen that the emperor had no clothes. Between October 5th and November 17th, 1861, Ezra Williams was credited with 11 similar attacks across Clark, Frederick, and Warren counties. The actual number might have been higher. Some incidents weren't reported, plantation owners reluctant to admit they'd lost control. Some were attributed to other resistance fighters, a growing network of formerly enslaved people who'd taken inspiration from Ezra's example. The authorities responded with increased patrols, hired more slave catchers, offered rewards that climbed from $50 to $500 for Ezra's capture. None of it worked. Ezra had learned something crucial during his 4 days on the run. The system depended on fear, and fear was just a choice, and choices could be changed. The third major confrontation occurred on October 22nd at a crossroads 6 miles east of Front Royal. Ezra had been traveling at night with Sarah and 3 others they'd freed from a plantation near Middletown. They encountered a patrol of 6 men from the local militia, armed with shotguns and convinced they'd found easy prey. The fight lasted approximately 4 minutes. When it was over, 2 militiamen were unconscious, 3 were in full retreat, and the last was pinned under his horse after it threw him in panic. Ezra let them all live, taking only their weapons and their dignity. Word of that confrontation reached Richmond within days, and the Confederate authorities began to realize they had a problem that couldn't be solved with more men or better weapons. Sarah Williams proved to be her father's daughter in ways that surprised even Ezra. At 12 years old, she became the group's scout, her small size allowing her to move through terrain and observe situations that would have been impossible for adults. On November 3rd, she provided warning that allowed Ezra and 6 others to avoid an ambush that would certainly have ended in capture or death. On November 9th, she discovered a cache of supplies hidden by Underground Railroad conductors, food and clothing that allowed the group to survive the first serious cold snap of approaching winter. Her value to their operations was such that Ezra began teaching her everything he knew about tracking, about reading terrain, about the hundreds of small signs that meant danger or safety. The Confederate response escalated through November. On November 12th, the Virginia General Assembly passed an emergency measure authorizing the use of regular Army troops to suppress slave rebellions, a tacit admission that local authorities had lost control. On November 15th, 3 companies of infantry were deployed to Clark County with orders to restore order by any means necessary. But by then, Ezra Williams had become something more than a man. He'd become an idea, and ideas were harder to kill than men. Enslaved people across the region began engaging in subtle acts of resistance. Tools broken at crucial moments, fires starting mysteriously, information about patrol movements mysteriously reaching those who needed to know. Between November 17th and November 24th, 1861, the situation reached a critical point. Confederate authorities were stretched thin, their attention divided between the growing Union threat to the north and the internal security crisis spreading through the Shenandoah Valley. Colonel Hargrove's plantation had lost 17 enslaved workers to escape, a financial blow that threatened his solvency. 5 other plantations reported similar losses. The entire economic structure of the region was beginning to show cracks. Then came November 25th, and what would later be called the Berryville Incident, though that name doesn't capture what actually happened. Ezra and his group, now numbering 14 including 6 children, had taken refuge in an abandoned barn 3 miles north of Berryville. They'd been there for 2 days, resting, treating injuries, making plans. Someone informed. Someone always informed. Fear or loyalty or the promise of reward. The motivations didn't matter. What mattered was that on the morning of November 25th, the barn was surrounded by 42 Confederate soldiers and local militia, all armed, all determined to end this embarrassing chapter of Virginia history. The senior officer, Captain Thomas Reynolds, called for surrender, promising fair treatment. This was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie, including Reynolds himself. But the lie had to be offered. Protocol demanded it. Ezra's response became the subject of much debate afterward. Some claimed he laughed. Others said he wept. Still others insisted he remained silent, that his refusal to respond was itself a form of communication. What's certain is that he didn't surrender. Instead, he sent out all the children first, including Sarah, their hands raised, making it clear they were unarmed and non-combatant. Confederate soldiers, whatever their flaws, generally didn't shoot children in front of witnesses. The children were taken into custody. Then Ezra sent out the women, 3 former slaves who joined the group over the previous weeks. They too were taken into custody, their surrender documented, their status returned to the ambiguous category of recaptured property. That left 5 men in the barn, Ezra Williams and 4 others whose names have been lost to history. Captain Reynolds gave them 1 hour to surrender. The hour passed in silence. Then Reynolds ordered his men to burn the barn. It was standard procedure for situations like this, though situations like this were supposed to be rare, exceptional. The barn caught quickly, dry wood and old hay providing plenty of fuel. Soldiers surrounded the building, rifles ready, waiting for the men inside to flee the flames. But Ezra Williams had spent 4 days tasting freedom and 11 weeks teaching others that fear was a choice. He'd crossed too many lines, become too much a symbol. Surrender meant public execution, meant being made an example of, meant having your death used to terrify others into compliance. The flames took approximately 45 minutes to make the barn structurally unsound. When the roof collapsed, it collapsed inward, sending up a tower of sparks and smoke visible for miles. No one ran out. No one surrendered. When the fire finally burned itself out and soldiers searched the ruins, they found 5 bodies so badly burned as to be nearly unrecognizable. One of them, identified by its size and position, was believed to be Ezra Williams. Sarah Williams, 12 years old, was returned to the Hargrove plantation under armed guard. But something had changed. Colonel Hargrove found himself unable to look at her without seeing her father's face, unable to assert his authority without wondering if this child might suddenly pick up a rock or a branch and make him pay for centuries of accumulated cruelty. He sold her 3 weeks later to a plantation in South Carolina, got less than half her estimated value, and was grateful to be rid of her. The hickory branch that started everything was never recovered. Some said it burned in the barn fire. Others claimed Ezra had given it to Sarah before sending her out, and she'd hidden it somewhere. Still others insisted it was picked up by one of the Confederate soldiers as a souvenir, taken home, eventually forgotten in an attic or barn. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is that for 11 weeks in the autumn of 1861, an enslaved man named Ezra Williams demonstrated that the system which claimed absolute power was vulnerable, that 3 armed professional slave catchers could be defeated by 1 unarmed man with a tree branch, that fear was a choice, and choices could be changed. The Confederate Army recorded 7 casualties in their operations against Ezra Williams and his group. 2 killed, 5 seriously wounded. They recovered 18 escaped slaves and restored them to their owners. They burned 1 barn, arrested 47 people for providing assistance, and congratulated themselves on restoring order. But the order they restored was different from the order that had existed before. Enslaved people across the Shenandoah Valley had seen that resistance was possible. Plantation owners had learned that absolute authority wasn't absolute after all. And somewhere in the calculations of Confederate military leadership, someone noted that suppressing internal slave rebellions required resources that might otherwise be used against the Union Army to the north. The Civil War would last another 3.5 years. The Emancipation Proclamation would be signed 14 months after Ezra Williams died in that burning barn. More than 180,000 black soldiers would fight for the Union Army. Many of them formerly enslaved people who'd heard stories of men like Ezra and decided that if he could fight, so could they. Sarah Williams survived the war, married a freedman named Thomas Garrett in 1867, had 6 children, and lived until 1923. She never spoke publicly about her father, but her grandchildren remembered her telling stories about a man who'd fought 3 armed slave catchers with a tree branch and taught his daughter that fear was just a choice. The photograph that captured this moment, or one like it, was taken by an unknown photographer, possibly a Union soldier or a traveling journalist, documenting the war's aftermath. It shows the instant before violence, the tension of confrontation, frozen in black and white. 3 armed men facing 1 man with a raised branch, his muscles taut, his face set in that expression that William Trask had struggled to describe. The photograph survived when so many others didn't, passed down through families, eventually ending up in archives where historians could study it and debate what it meant. Some saw it as evidence of the brutality of the slave system. Others interpreted it as a moment of resistance, of human dignity asserting itself against impossible odds. But perhaps the most important thing about the photograph is what it doesn't show. The 4 days of running that preceded this moment. The 23 years of bondage that created the man in the image, the 12-year-old girl watching from behind the trees, and the 11 weeks of resistance that would follow when this frozen instant became action. Ezra Williams was not the only enslaved person to fight back. He was not the most successful or the most strategic. His resistance ended in death. His efforts to free others lasted less than 3 months, and the system he fought against continued for years after his death. But he proved something that couldn't be unproven: that the carefully constructed hierarchy of slavery, backed by laws and weapons and centuries of tradition, could be challenged by one man with a tree branch if that man decided he'd had enough. The hickory branch weighed 3 pounds, cost nothing, required no special training to use effectively. But in Ezra Williams' hands, it became more valuable than any weapon, more powerful than any law, because it was wielded by someone who'd made a fundamental choice: that being dead was preferable to being property, that fighting and losing was better than submitting and surviving, that 14 seconds of violence was worth 23 years of waiting. This is what the photograph captures, if you know how to look at it. Not the moment before death, but the moment when property became person, when submission became resistance, when fear stopped being a choice. The Confederate Army won that battle. They always won those battles. They had more men, better weapons, the full force of law and custom and tradition behind them. But they were fighting an enemy they'd created themselves. And that enemy had learned something they'd tried so hard to keep hidden: that the system was vulnerable, that fear was optional, that a man with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than any army. Ezra Williams died on November 25, 1861, age 23, in a burning barn 3 miles north of Berryville, Virginia. He'd been enslaved for 23 years, free for 11 weeks and 4 days. In that brief window of liberation, he'd fought 3 armed slave catchers and won, inspired dozens of others to resistance, required the deployment of Confederate Army troops to suppress his activities, and proved that the carefully maintained fiction of absolute white authority could be shattered by one determined man with a hickory branch. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was accepting that his life and his death meant nothing at all. The dog handlers didn't stop running until they reached Winchester, arriving just after noon on September 17th, with their story already taking on the quality of legend. By the time they found Colonel Marcus Hargrove at the Shenandoah Hotel, drinking bourbon and discussing cotton prices with 3 other plantation owners, the tale had acquired details that hadn't existed in the original event. The black man had been 7 feet tall, they claimed, with muscles like iron and eyes that glowed red in the morning light. He'd moved faster than any human should be able to move, had struck 3 armed men before any of them could react, had laughed while doing it. Hargrove listened to this breathless recounting, his face growing darker with each embellishment, and said only 3 words: "Assemble the men." Within 4 hours, Hargrove had gathered 23 armed men from Winchester and the surrounding plantations, a mix of overseers, slave catchers, and local militia members who saw both financial opportunity and entertainment in the hunt. They rode out at 4 in the afternoon, following the trail the dog handlers had marked, expecting to find Ezra Williams and his daughter within a few hours. Expecting, in fact, to find them still in the area, perhaps hiding in the woods nearby, certainly not organized or prepared for pursuit. What they found instead was nothing. The clearing where William Trask and the McCready brothers had fallen was empty except for trampled leaves and bloodstains already turning brown in the afternoon sun. The 3 injured men had been collected by their associates and transported back to town, where a doctor was attempting to determine whether James McCready would ever wake up from the blow to his skull. Trask had a fractured temporal bone and permanent hearing loss in his left ear. Robert McCready had 3 broken ribs, a shattered jaw, and would never again speak clearly. But Ezra and Sarah were gone, vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. The tracking dogs, when they finally arrived, refused to follow the trail, whining and pulling backward on their leads, their tails tucked between their legs. The handlers, already traumatized by what they'd witnessed that morning, didn't push the issue. Colonel Hargrove cursed, threatened, offered increased bounties, and eventually returned to Winchester, having accomplished nothing except wasting a day and demonstrating that the situation was more complex than anyone had anticipated. That night, in 3 separate slave quarters within 10 miles of Winchester, enslaved people whispered the story of what had happened in the clearing. The details varied, but the core message remained constant. A man who'd been property had fought 3 armed white men and won. A 12-year-old girl had cracked a slave catcher's skull with a rock, and both of them had walked away free. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For people who'd spent their entire lives being told that white authority was absolute, that resistance meant death, that the system was unbreakable, this single incident provided evidence that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Ezra Williams understood this impact in a way that would have surprised those who'd known him on the Hargrove plantation. During his 23 years in bondage, he'd been perceived as quiet, compliant, perhaps a bit slow. This was deliberate. He'd learned early that intelligent slaves attracted negative attention, that asking questions led to punishment, that the safest way to survive was to appear simple and obedient, while keeping your actual thoughts buried deep where no overseer could find them. But those buried thoughts had been growing for years, fed by every indignity and every casual cruelty, watered by the knowledge that his daughter was growing up in the same system that had destroyed his mother and would eventually destroy her. The 4 days of running had changed him, not by making him brave, but by making him desperate. And desperation combined with intelligence was more dangerous than either quality alone. On September 18th, the day after the confrontation in the clearing, Ezra made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of heading north toward Union lines, toward the theoretical safety of free territory, he turned south and west, deeper into Confederate Virginia, toward the very heart of the slave system that wanted him dead. This decision made no tactical sense. Every mile south was a mile further from safety, a mile deeper into hostile territory where any white person could demand his papers, where any patrol could capture him, where the entire apparatus of law and custom and social structure was designed to prevent exactly the kind of movement he was attempting. But Ezra wasn't thinking tactically. He was thinking strategically, operating from an understanding that 400 years of African resistance had developed. That the system's greatest vulnerability wasn't its laws or its weapons, but the minds of those it claimed to own. The second confrontation came 18 days after the first, on October 5th, 1861, at the Hendricks Plantation 14 miles south of Winchester. Ezra had been watching the place for 3 days, studying the patterns, learning the routine. The plantation was mid-sized, about 800 acres, with 43 enslaved workers and an overseer named Calvin Brewster, who'd earned a reputation for particular cruelty. Brewster had a habit consistent as clockwork of walking through the slave quarters every evening at dusk, making his presence known, asserting his authority over the people who lived in those rough cabins. He carried a pistol in a holster at his hip and a bullwhip coiled over his shoulder, and he'd been known to use both without provocation or warning. On the evening of October 5th, Ezra waited for him behind the smokehouse, pressed flat against the rough wooden planks, the hickory branch gripped in both hands, his breathing slow and controlled. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if Ezra had been in any condition to appreciate beauty. He was hungry, having eaten nothing but wild persimmons and a handful of hickory nuts in the past 2 days. His feet were blistered from walking on rough terrain with inadequate shoes. His shoulder ached where he'd slept on it wrong the previous night. But his hands on the hickory branch were steady, and his mind was clear with the particular clarity that comes when you've accepted that you might die in the next few minutes and decided that some things are worth dying for. He could hear Brewster before he saw him, the overseer's boots crunching on the gravel path, his voice raised as he called out to someone in one of the cabins. "You there, Samuel? I better not hear about you slacking off tomorrow. I hear you've been complaining about the heat. You want to know about heat? I can show you heat." The threat in those words was casual, automatic. The kind of thing Brewster said a dozen times a day, without thinking. He'd been an overseer for 11 years, had whipped more than 200 people during that time, and saw absolutely nothing wrong with any of it. He was maintaining order, keeping property in line, doing the job he was paid to do. When he came around the corner of the smokehouse, Ezra stepped out of the shadows. The movement was sudden enough that Brewster's hand dropped to his pistol, his fingers closing around the grip, his thumb finding the hammer. But Ezra was already inside his reach, the hickory branch swinging in a horizontal arc that caught Brewster across the right forearm with enough force to shatter both radius and ulna bones. The crack of breaking bones was clearly audible in the evening quiet, a sound like a green tree branch snapping under too much weight. Brewster's pistol fell from suddenly nerveless fingers, and he opened his mouth to scream. The hickory branch reversed direction, the movement fluid and practiced, coming back across to catch Brewster on the left temple. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to send him sprawling in the dirt, his eyes rolling back, blood trickling from his ear. The entire sequence took approximately 3 seconds. Ezra picked up the fallen pistol, a .36 caliber Navy Colt similar to the one he'd taken from William Trask, checked that it was loaded, and tucked it into his belt. Then he looked up to find 7 enslaved workers standing in the doorways of their cabins, staring at him with expressions that ranged from terror to something that might have been hope but was too fragile to survive being named. "Evening," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Name's Ezra Williams. Used to belong to Colonel Hargrove up near Winchester. Don't belong to anybody now." He gestured down at Brewster, who was groaning softly, trying to push himself up with his one good arm. "This man won't be whipping anybody for a while. Maybe never again. I'm telling you this so you know it's possible. They're not gods. They're just men, and men can be hurt." Then he vanished into the darkness, moving quickly through the fields, putting distance between himself and the plantation before anyone could organize pursuit. Behind him, in the slave quarters, 7 people stood in shocked silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. One of them, a woman named Martha who'd been on the Hendricks plantation for 18 years, would later testify that watching Ezra Williams incapacitate the overseer changed something fundamental in how she understood the world. "We'd been told all our lives that resistance was impossible," she said in an interview conducted in 1898, when she was 63 years old and had been free for 33 years. That white men had all the power, that we were nothing. But that night, I saw a black man hit a white overseer, and the white man fell down just like anybody else would. It sounds simple, but understanding that simple fact changed everything. Between October 5th and November 17th, 1861, Ezra Williams appeared at 11 different plantations across Clark, Frederick, and Warren counties, a geographical area of approximately 450 square miles. At each location, the pattern was similar. He would observe for several days, learning routines and identifying targets, then strike quickly against overseers or slave catchers, inflicting injuries that range from broken bones to concussions, always escaping before organized pursuit could be mounted. The psychological impact of these attacks far exceeded their tactical significance. Each incident was reported to local authorities, and each report made the situation sound more desperate, the threat more serious. By mid-October, the reward for Ezra's capture had climbed from $50 to $200. By early November, it had reached $500, a sum equivalent to roughly $15,000 in modern currency. But money couldn't solve the fundamental problem, which was that Ezra Williams had become a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will, striking targets seemingly at random, leaving behind injured white men and emboldened black people. The third major confrontation occurred on October 22nd at a crossroads 6 miles east of Front Royal, and it was different from the previous encounters in ways that suggested Ezra's tactics were evolving. He was no longer alone. Sarah was with him, as always. But now there were 3 others. Moses, a field hand who'd escaped from a plantation near Middletown. Rebecca, a house servant who'd poisoned her master's dinner, not fatally but enough to buy her time to run. And Daniel, a young man of 19 who'd been scheduled for sale and decided death in the woods was preferable to life on a Louisiana sugar plantation. They were traveling at night, moving north for the first time since Ezra had begun his campaign, heading toward what they hoped might be Union lines, though the position of those lines changed daily, and nobody was certain where safety might actually be found. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, they encountered a patrol of 6 men from the local militia, part of the increased security measures that had been implemented across the region. The militiamen were mounted, armed with shotguns and pistols, and initially confident they'd found easy prey. Their leader, a hardware store owner named Thomas Whitfield, called out for the group to halt, his voice loud in the pre-dawn darkness. Ezra's response was to send Sarah running into the trees, with instructions to circle around behind the patrol, then to step forward himself, the hickory branch visible in the moonlight, the 2 Navy Colt revolvers tucked into his belt. "We're not stopping," Ezra said clearly, "and we're not going back. If you try to take us, some of you won't be going home to your families." The confidence in his voice, the complete absence of fear or submission, unsettled the militiamen in ways they couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't how enslaved people were supposed to talk. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Whitfield, trying to reassert control, urged his horse forward, raising his shotgun. "You're coming back dead or alive, boy. Those are the only choices." Then several things happened very quickly, compressed into approximately 4 minutes of chaotic violence that none of the participants would remember clearly afterward. Moses threw a rock with enough force to knock one of the militiamen from his saddle, the man's horse rearing in panic. Daniel rushed another militiaman, grabbing his leg and pulling him down, the 2 of them rolling in the dirt, fighting for control of a pistol. Ezra moved forward with the hickory branch, striking at horses rather than men, driving the animals into terrified bucking that unseated their riders and scattered the patrol's formation. Sarah, circling through the trees as instructed, emerged behind the patrol and fired the small .31 caliber pocket pistol her father had given her, aiming high, not trying to hit anyone, but creating the impression that they were surrounded. The sound of the shot, loud in the darkness, convinced the remaining militiamen that they were facing a larger force than they'd anticipated. 2 of them fled immediately, spurring their horses back toward Front Royal. A third tried to rally, managed to fire his shotgun once, the load passing several feet over Ezra's head, then thought better of continuing the fight and retreated as well. That left Thomas Whitfield and 2 others, all now on foot, their horses having bolted. Whitfield had dropped his shotgun and drawn a pistol, was trying to aim in the darkness at targets that kept moving. Ezra hit him across the collarbone with a hickory branch, a controlled strike that broke bone but avoided the potentially fatal injury that a blow to the head would have caused. Whitfield went down hard, and the last two militiamen, seeing their leader incapacitated, decided discretion was the better part of valor and ran. The entire confrontation, from first contact to the final militiaman fleeing, lasted approximately 4 minutes and left Thomas Whitfield with a broken collarbone, another man with a concussion from being thrown from his horse, and 6 militiamen with shattered confidence and a story that grew more elaborate with each telling. More importantly, it demonstrated that Ezra's tactics were working. He was no longer fighting alone. He was building a network, teaching others that resistance was possible, creating a model that could be replicated. The 4 people who escaped that night would reach Union lines 11 days later, on November 2nd, after a harrowing journey through Confederate territory. Rebecca and Daniel would eventually settle in Pennsylvania, would marry other formerly enslaved people, would have children who would grow up free. Moses would join the Union Army, would serve in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, would survive the war and live until 1891. Their freedom was purchased with Ezra's hickory branch and the lesson it taught: that the system was vulnerable, that white authority could be challenged, that fighting back was not suicide, but survival. Sarah Williams, in the weeks following the Front Royal confrontation, emerged as a crucial element of her father's operations in ways that would have been unthinkable for a 12-year-old girl in any other context. But these weren't normal contexts, and Sarah wasn't a normal 12-year-old. She'd watched her father fight 3 armed slave catchers and win. She'd cracked a man's skull with a rock when she was scared enough to wet herself, but brave enough to act anyway. She'd spent 4 weeks moving through Confederate territory, learning to read tracks, to identify threats, to assess situations with a clarity that most adults never developed. Her small size, which had been a liability in the world of plantation labor, became an asset in the world of resistance. She could move through terrain that adult men couldn't navigate, could observe from positions that would have been impossible for larger people, could pass as a lost child when necessary, and blend into the shadows when that strategy served better. On November 3rd, Sarah's scouting prevented an ambush that would certainly have ended in death or capture. Ezra and 6 others were approaching a barn where they'd been told they could find food and shelter, guided by information from enslaved workers on a nearby plantation. Sarah, ranging ahead as had become her practice, saw the trap before they walked into it. 15 militiamen hiding in and around the barn, their horses tethered out of sight, their weapons ready. She circled back, found her father, and delivered the warning with a calm that belied her age. "It's a trap. 15 men, maybe more. They knew we were coming." The group reversed course, melted back into the countryside, and avoided what Confederate authorities later described in their after-action report as a certain engagement that would have eliminated the Williams threat permanently. The informant who'd betrayed them was never identified. But 2 weeks later, that same plantation's overseer was found unconscious in a field. His right arm broken in 3 places, the signature wound that Ezra Williams left on those who'd earned his attention. On November 9th, Sarah discovered something even more valuable: a cache of supplies left by Underground Railroad conductors, hidden in a hollow tree 3 miles west of Berryville. The cache contained food, warm clothing, blankets, and a note explaining that more supplies would be left at specified locations if the group could continue moving north. This discovery allowed them to survive the first serious cold snap of the approaching winter. Temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. Frost forming on the ground in patterns that looked like lace in the morning light. Without those supplies, Without Sarah's sharp eyes and willingness to investigate every unusual marking or disturbance in the landscape, the group would have faced a choice between freezing and risking exposure by lighting fires that could be seen for miles. By mid-November, the situation had escalated beyond anyone's initial expectations. The Virginia General Assembly, meeting in emergency session on November 12th, passed legislation authorizing the use of regular Confederate Army troops to suppress what they termed insurrectionary activity by rebellious slaves and their sympathizers. The language of the legislation was careful, designed to avoid acknowledging the scale of the problem while providing legal cover for military intervention. But the subtext was clear. Local authorities had lost control, the situation was deteriorating, and extreme measures were necessary. On November 15th, 3 companies of Confederate infantry, approximately 360 men, were deployed to Clark County under the command of Captain Thomas Reynolds, a career military officer who'd served in the Mexican-American War and had extensive experience with what the Army termed pacification operations. Reynolds was a practical man, neither particularly cruel nor especially compassionate, committed primarily to completing his assigned mission with minimum casualties on both sides. He established headquarters in Winchester, organized his troops into mobile patrols, implemented a pass system that required all black people to carry documentation of their movements, and offered amnesty to any enslaved person who surrendered voluntarily. This amnesty was, of course, a lie in any meaningful sense. Surrendering meant returning to bondage, meant facing punishment for running, meant giving up the brief taste of freedom that some had experienced. But Reynolds made the offer because protocol required it, because the fiction of benevolent authority had to be maintained, even when everyone involved understood it was fiction. The response to his amnesty offer was silence. Nobody surrendered. Nobody came forward. Instead, the incidents continued. On November 17th, an overseer in Warren County was attacked and left with a fractured skull. On November 19th, a patrol of militiamen reported being ambushed by at least 20 armed Negroes, though subsequent investigation suggested the actual number was probably 5 or 6. On November 21st, 2 slave catchers tracking a family of runaways found themselves surrounded, disarmed, and sent back to town on foot. Their horses taken, their weapons confiscated, their dignity thoroughly shredded. Colonel Marcus Hargrove, who'd started this entire sequence of events by sending slave catchers after his property, was watching his fortune disintegrate with remarkable speed. Since September 17th, 17 enslaved workers had escaped from his plantation, representing a financial loss of approximately $13,000 in modern equivalent. 5 others had been injured in what were later determined to be deliberate accidents. Tools breaking at precisely the wrong moments. Cart wheels coming loose during transport. A barn fire that was almost certainly arson, though no evidence could prove it. Hargrove's cotton harvest was 3 weeks behind schedule. His neighboring planters were experiencing similar problems. The entire economic structure of the Shenandoah Valley plantation system was showing cracks, and those cracks were spreading, traced back to a single morning when a man with a hickory branch had decided he'd rather die than remain property. The end began on November 24th with betrayal, though the identity of the betrayer was never confirmed. Ezra's group, now numbering 14 people including 6 children, had taken shelter in an abandoned barn 3 miles north of Berryville. They'd been there for 2 days, resting, treating injuries. Daniel had a badly infected foot. Moses was sick with what was probably pneumonia. Rebecca had twisted her ankle while running from a patrol. They were trying to decide whether to push north toward Union lines or continue their campaign of resistance. Someone knew where they were. Someone shared that knowledge with authorities. Whether motivated by fear, by the promise of reward, by genuine belief in the righteousness of the slave system, or simply by exhaustion with the constant danger of harboring fugitives. Someone told Captain Reynolds exactly where to find Ezra Williams and his group. On the morning of November 25, 1861, at approximately 6:30 a.m., the barn was surrounded by 42 soldiers and 23 militiamen, a force so overwhelming that resistance seemed impossible. Captain Reynolds, believing he could end this matter without additional bloodshed, called out for surrender. "Ezra Williams, I know you're in there. I know you have women and children with you. Come out now, hands raised, and I give you my word that the children will not be harmed. You'll be returned to your rightful owners and face appropriate consequences for your actions. But the children won't be hurt. You have my word as an officer." Inside the barn, Ezra stood among the others, looking at the faces of people who'd trusted him, who'd followed him, who'd believed his promise that resistance was possible and freedom was worth fighting for. 6 children ranging in age from 4 to 12, including Sarah. 3 women, including Rebecca, who'd poisoned her master to escape. 4 men, including Moses, who was too sick to walk, let alone run or fight. The barn had one door, no windows large enough for an adult to pass through, and walls too thick to shoot through effectively. They were trapped, completely and thoroughly trapped, with no options visible except surrender or death. Ezra made his decision quickly, communicated it to the others in whispers, received nods of understanding, if not agreement. Then he called out to Reynolds. "The children come out first, all 6 of them. They get safe passage, no tricks, no arrests. Then the women. Then we'll talk about the rest." Reynolds, surprised by the negotiation, but willing to accept these terms, agreed. One by one, the children emerged from the barn, their hands raised, their faces terrified, their small bodies shaking with fear and cold in the November morning. Sarah came out last, walking slowly, her eyes finding her father one final time through the crack in the barn door. What passed between them in that look would be debated by her grandchildren decades later when she finally, reluctantly, spoke about these events. Some said she looked defiant. Others claimed they saw only fear. Still others insisted her expression was one of understanding, of acceptance that some things are worth dying for even when you're 12 years old and terrified. The soldiers took the children into custody gently, wrapping blankets around their shoulders, offering water and bread. Then the 3 women emerged, Rebecca last, walking with her head high, refusing to show the fear she felt. They too were taken into custody, their status immediately reverting to property, their brief freedom ending in chains that would be literal as well as metaphorical. That left 5 men in the barn: Ezra Williams, Moses despite his sickness, Daniel despite his infected foot, and 2 others whose names were never recorded in any official document, whose identities were lost in the chaos and violence that followed. Reynolds called out again, "Come out now, Williams. You've protected the children and the women. Time to end this." The silence from the barn stretched for 30 seconds, then 60, then 2 minutes. When Ezra finally responded, his voice was clear and calm and absolutely certain. "No, we're done being property. We'd rather burn." Reynolds, a practical man who'd seen enough death in Mexico to last a lifetime, tried reasoning, tried threatening, tried offering deals. He gave them 1 hour to reconsider, to come to their senses, to accept that this couldn't end any other way. The hour passed in complete silence. Then Reynolds, following protocol and personal inclination in equal measure, ordered his men to burn the barn. 4 soldiers approached with torches, moving carefully, expecting shots from inside. No shots came. They threw the torches against the barn's walls, against the pile of dry hay visible through gaps in the boards, against any surface that looked likely to catch. The wood was old, seasoned by decades of sun and rain, dry despite the morning dew. It caught quickly, flames spreading with remarkable speed, smoke beginning to pour from every gap and crack. Reynolds positioned his men in a complete circle around the burning structure, rifles ready, prepared for the moment when the heat became unbearable, and the men inside tried to flee. That moment never came. The fire burned for approximately 45 minutes before the structure became unstable. The roof, weakened by flames eating through the support beams, collapsed inward with a roar that could be heard in Berryville 3 miles away. A tower of sparks erupted into the sky, visible for miles, a signal that would later take on symbolic significance to enslaved people across Virginia. When the fire finally burned itself out and soldiers carefully searched the ruins, they found 5 bodies, burned beyond recognition, identified only by their positions and sizes. Captain Reynolds filed his report on November 26th, documenting the successful suppression of slave insurrection, the recovery of 9 escaped slaves, 6 children and 3 women, and the deaths of 5 male insurgents. The report was factual, detailed, and entirely missed the point. Ezra Williams was dead, but the idea he represented couldn't be killed by fire or bullets or overwhelming force. Sarah Williams, 12 years old, was returned to Colonel Hargrove's custody under armed guard. But when Hargrove looked at her, he saw her father's face, saw the rock coming down on James McCready's skull, saw every moment of defiance that Ezra Williams had embodied. He couldn't bring himself to keep her, couldn't bring himself to trust that she wouldn't, someday, pick up her own hickory branch and teach him the same lesson her father had taught William Trask. 3 weeks later, he sold her to a plantation in South Carolina for $320, less than half her assessed value, and considered himself fortunate to be rid of her. The hickory branch that Ezra Williams had used to incapacitate 3 armed slave catchers on September 17th was never recovered. Some claimed it burned in the barn fire on November 25th. Others insisted Ezra had given it to Sarah before sending her out, that she'd hidden it somewhere, that it was buried or concealed and might someday be found. Still others believed one of the Confederate soldiers had taken it as a souvenir, had carried it home, had kept it in an attic or barn where it slowly aged and was eventually forgotten, its significance lost to time. The actual fate of that piece of hickory wood doesn't matter. What matters is what it represented during its 11 weeks of operational use. Physical proof that the system which claimed absolute authority could be challenged, that fear was a choice, that property could become person through the simple expedient of deciding that death was preferable to bondage. Confederate authorities recorded 7 casualties in their operations against Ezra Williams and his network. 2 soldiers killed in incidents that may or may not have been directly related to Ezra's activities. 5 seriously wounded, including William Trask, who never fully recovered from his head injury. They recovered 18 escaped slaves over the course of the campaign and restored them to their owners, though several of those individuals would escape again within months. They burned 1 barn, arrested 47 people for providing assistance to runaways, charges that were largely dropped when prosecuting attorneys couldn't produce sufficient evidence, and declared the matter successfully resolved. But the costs extended far beyond what appeared in official records. The deployment of 3 companies of Confederate infantry to suppress slave insurrection meant those troops weren't available for operations against Union forces. The psychological impact on enslaved populations across 3 counties meant productivity declined measurably through late 1861 and early 1862. And the demonstration that resistance was possible inspired others to similar actions. a ripple effect that Confederate authorities tried desperately to suppress by controlling information and limiting the spread of Ezra's story. The Civil War would continue for another 3.5 years after Ezra Williams died in that burning barn. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, would legally free enslaved people in Confederate territory 14 months after Ezra's death. More than 180,000 black soldiers would serve in the Union Army before the war ended, many of them formerly enslaved people who'd heard stories of men like Ezra Williams and decided that if he could fight, so could they. Moses survived the war, settled in Boston, worked as a carpenter for 33 years, died in 1891 at the age of 57, and was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery with full military honors. Sarah Williams survived the war through combination of luck, intelligence, and careful navigation of impossible situations. Sold to a South Carolina plantation in December 1861, she endured 4 years of bondage that she rarely discussed in later life. She was freed by advancing Union troops in February 1865, made her way north through a countryside devastated by war, and reached Pennsylvania in May of that year. She married Thomas Garrett, a freedman and Union Army veteran, in 1867. They had 6 children, raised them in Philadelphia, taught them to read and write, sent them to schools that their mother had only dreamed about. Sarah lived until 1923, dying at the age of 74. Having witnessed the end of slavery, the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow, and the beginning of the Great Migration. Her grandchildren remembered her as a quiet woman who rarely spoke about the past, but occasionally, usually on cold November mornings, would tell stories about a man who'd fought 3 armed slave catchers with a tree branch and taught his daughter that fear was just a choice. Ezra Williams died on November 25, 1861, age 23, in a burning barn 3 miles north of Berryville, Virginia. He'd been enslaved for 23 years, owned by Colonel Marcus Hargrove, valued at $850 in estate ledgers, treated as property from birth. He'd been free for exactly 11 weeks and 4 days. From September 17th, when he incapacitated William Trask in that clearing west of Winchester, to November 25th, when Captain Reynolds's soldiers set fire to the barn. In that brief window of liberation, he'd fought 3 armed slave catchers and won, survived dozens of near captures, injured or disabled at least 11 overseers and slave catchers across 3 Virginia counties, inspired unknown numbers of others to resistance both armed and subtle, required the deployment of Confederate Army troops to suppress his activities, cost the plantation system significant financial losses in escaped workers and reduced productivity, and proved that the carefully maintained fiction of absolute white authority could be shattered by one determined man with a hickory branch and the willingness to use it. 11 weeks and 4 days. In the grand sweep of American history, in the 4-year catastrophe of the Civil War, in the centuries-long crime of slavery that defined the nation's character, 11 weeks is nothing, barely a rounding error, too brief to matter. Except it did matter. It mattered to the 17 workers who escaped from the Hargrove plantation and tasted freedom. It mattered to Sarah Williams, who survived to age 74 and raised 6 free children in Philadelphia. It mattered to the enslaved people across Virginia who heard the story and understood that resistance was possible. It mattered to Moses, who joined the Union Army and survived the war. It mattered to the Confederate military planners who had to divert troops from the front lines to suppress internal rebellion. And it matters to us, more than a century and a half later, as evidence that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. That absolute authority is never as absolute as it claims, and that the choice to resist, even when resistance seems suicidal, Even when victory seems impossible, even when the outcome is almost certain death, is a choice worth making. Because the alternative is accepting that your life means nothing. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was accepting that Ezra Williams lived and died as property. That his 23 years of bondage and his 11 weeks of resistance added up to nothing. That his death in that burning barn was just another statistic in the ledgers of Confederate military operations. But he didn't die as property. He died as a person, having made the choice to be person, having demonstrated through his actions that property could become person through the simple expedient of deciding that death was preferable to bondage. And that choice, made by one man in one clearing on one September morning, captured in one photograph that may or may not be historically accurate, echoed forward through time in ways that neither Ezra Williams nor anyone else could have predicted, proving that the most dangerous thing a system of oppression can face isn't an army or a law or a political movement, but one person who decides they've had enough and picks up whatever is at hand, even if it's nothing but a hickory branch, and says, "No more."